Hi everyone, my name is Erik Adler, and today I would like to read to you the first half of the first chapter from my book White Lights. I already read the prologue and the first intermediate chapter telling about our hero or anti-hero, Richard. In the prologue he was looking for a job because his wife had left him, and so he had to move out of the house and look for work because he had been staying at home with their daughter for the last 5 years. And in the intermediate chapter we learned a little bit about his background. He had a dream about his family dying in a car accident, and we learned about him leaving the house and his wife and the daughter in this intermediate chapter called Breakup. And today I will read, as I said, the first half of the first chapter to you, where his real dreams, so to speak, start, where he discovers this fantasy world through his dreams. And I want to stress that this book contains violence and sex, which means it's not suitable for children. And again, I translated this text myself from German into English, so please be aware that my English is not perfect, of course. I'm not a mother speaker, so this translation of course has to be checked by a mother speaker before it can go into publication sometime in the future. So here we go. Chapter 1 is called The Island of the Blessed. The chapters are divided into sections, and this first section is called The Old Chinese. The sound of the sea. Heat. Richard opened his eyes and looked up into a deep blue sky. The sun caressed his naked skin. His mouth was dry and he was thirsty. He was laying on something soft like a fur. Through it he could feel hard spots like small stones. Camel's hair. He rose to his elbow. The fur was sand-colored with some dark streaks, and it covered almost all of his body. Then his gaze fell upon himself. His shape was different. His arms, his chest and his legs were enormous, but the proportionality and definition were lacking. His shoulders were small compared to the rest of his body, and there was the hint of a belly. A power lifter. Only now did he realize that he was wearing a beard. He stroked it with his hand. It was tight and curly. His hair was long, curly and black. Who was he? The sound of waves. He sat up. He was lying on a stony beach. Just a few yards away was the sea, and in it was an island, like a mountain, rising from the water. Richard got up and went down to the shore. The water was cool, but not too cold for a bath. There was something moving behind him. He turned around. Behind a cliff, a shape appeared. It was an old man, leaning on a cane. The stranger approached him, his back bent. It was an Asian, wearing a traditional Chinese-looking jacket and soft pants. His long white hair and beard were shimmering in the sunlight. He halted and hung on his cane, his old body shivering. But the gaze that met Richard was alert and clear. Richard felt ashamed because of his nakedness. There was nothing behind him but the sea. "You want to go to the island of the blessed?" the old man asked. "Eager to meet girls, yes?" he added, smiling mischievously. Richard stared at him. "Yes," he stammered. "Then don't stand around doing nothing. Grab your things and come. They need you over there." Laughing in his old voice, he began walking across the shore. His things. Then he remembered the fur and picked it up. He put it over his shoulders, for he did not know what else to do with it. There was something else laying on the sand. A huge bone from some kind of animal. He lifted it. It was not very heavy. He remembered the stranger and turned around. The old man had already disappeared behind a large stone. Richard hurried after him. The Asian's words rang in his ears. Yes, he was eager to meet girls. The heat, the fresh air from the sea, his strength and his nakedness excited him. "You can do anything," he heard an inner voice saying. "The earth belongs to you. Take what you want." He rounded the cliff and saw the old man in the distance, like a white glimmer in the sun. How was he able to walk that fast? Richard started running, not to lose sight of the shape. His soles were aching. The Chinese approached something on the shore, long and flat in dark grey, a rowing boat. He halted next to it and stood motionless, looking out onto the horizon. Richard felt ridiculous. He slowed his steps. There was a sack in the boat. The race had increased his thirst. He looked greedily at the sack, but did not dare to reach out for it. "Push out the boat, we haven't got all day." Richard put the club on the bottom, went over to the bow and pushed. Soon the small craft was rocking merrily on the waves. "What's on the island?" he asked. "What you're looking for," the Chinese said, chuckling. "And in the sack?" "What you're looking for." "Why do I need the club if there are just girls on the island?" "Not just girls. Be careful. They are shooting at each other over there." Richard sighed. He gave the boat a shove, jumped in and looked back at the shore. The old man had disappeared. Richard sat still for a moment. The sun burned his head and he was already sweating under the fur. He laid it on the bottom of the boat and reached for the oars. After what the strange old man had told him, he was reluctant to turn his back on the island. Perhaps there were snipers hiding on the shore, waiting for him to get into firing range. If so, it was foolish to approach it in a boat like this. The water was very clear. Isolated streaks of cloud were floating in the sky like smoke. Rowing was pleasant. Richard felt his big muscles moving. After a few hundred yards, he pulled in the oars and looked at the bag between his feet. He had to drink. His thirst quickly robbed him of his strength. The plug set tight, but by turning it, he managed to pull it out. The fluid inside looked like normal drinking water. He put his finger in it and into his mouth. Water. Relieved, he drank the sack dry. Instantly he felt new energy flowing through his limbs. He threw the sack on the bottom of the boat and began rowing quickly and strongly. Every now and then he turned around to look at the island, which was slowly growing in size. Now he could recognize different colors: the blue of the mountain, a dull green forest, and terraces in red, yellow, and white. This was not a work of nature. People had been contributing to this stepped form of the mountainside. Near the crest was a small white square, a house. There was no boat bridge in sight, so he made for the beach. Shortly before the island he stopped. There was no sound except for the waves. If the hidden snipers wanted to blow his head off, now was the right time. Anxiously he continued the last few yards, waded ashore and pulled the boat up. He looked out at the sea and froze. Before him was no coast, only the horizon far away. Had the earth itself turned against him, would the ground on which he was standing suddenly rise to throw him off? He did not want to turn around to face the island, but he had to. It was still there. He put the fur back over his shoulders, took the sack and the club and walked towards the forest. These were oaks with huge roots. There was a sour smell. Soon his arms and thighs were full of mosquito bites. The ground rose sharply. Here and there were cliffs consisting of black volcanic stone. Gradually the trees gave way. When he finally reached the lowest terrace, he stopped, leaned on the club and watched the scenery before him. It was a large garden with red flowers in all imaginable nuances, shapes and sizes. Richard recognized the poppy, the rose, the lily and the dahlia. Butterflies were whirling like a white golden rain over the landscape. Water fell glittering from the next terrace and disappeared rippling in the bushes, crowned by small rainbows. A narrow stone path ran between the flower beds. Richard felt his thirst again, and he longed to wash off all the sweat. He followed the warm stones to the first of the small waterfalls. Grass and shrubbery were shining with moisture. The damp intensified the scent. He threw sack, club and fur into the grass and stepped under the stream. He drank until his stomach was full and his throat and lungs burned with cold. As he turned around to get out of the waterfall, he saw a slender figure and heard a bright laughter. Second section, Aigle. Surprised, he took a step forward. Before him stood a tall girl in a light blue dress. Her blonde hair fell curly over her shoulders. She smiled and looked at him with no sign of embarrassment. Richard felt his face turn red, not because of his bare genitals, but because of his belly. He became aware of the fact that he was staring at her, his mouth open. "You are here at last." There was respect in her eyes, even admiration. He was smiling back at her sheepishly. He could think of nothing to say. "I'm Aigle. My sisters and I have been waiting for you for a long time. We need to fear no more." Richard wanted to ask her what they had feared, but he just muttered his name. Aigle looked down at the fur. "That's your clothes? That won't do. I'll make you something more comfortable." As she reached down, the inside of her thigh became visible. But Richard was faster. He took the fur and put it back over his shoulder. Aigle picked up the empty sack. "Come, let's join the others," she said. She led the way to the middle of the terrace. There was a broad marble staircase leading up to the house. The next plateau shone in blue and violet of many strange flowers that Richard did not know. The third was dominated by yellow and orange, the fourth by pink and apricot. The top terrace looked like a winter landscape, for the flowers were all white. In front of the house was an orchard in a large oval, in the center an apple tree. To the right, two young women dressed in bright colors were pouring water from a well into glass jugs. Another three were just coming out of the house, carrying baskets with fruit on their heads. When they saw Richard and the girl, they put down their things on the grass and came running towards them, laughing. They encircled Richard, laid their hands on his arms and chest, calling out in wonder. Never before had he experienced such a loving admiration. But his nakedness and his primitive appearance with fur, club and drooping wet hair embarrassed him, and he did not dare to meet the passionate gazes coming from all directions. In his mind he prayed that Eigle, who was the only one he knew by name, and who seemed to be the youngest, would rescue him from the situation. And she seemed to notice his malaise. "Please, dear sisters, leave him alone," she said, pushing away the young bodies, which were moving around him as if in an intimate dance. The laughter and chattering finally stopped. The women remained at a respectful distance, staring at him with shining eyes. "Come into the house, Richard, and let me make you a coat," she said, grabbing his hand. Although much older, Richard felt like a child, following his mother. Inside it was cooler. Richard was glad to be rid of the obtrusive women, even if the ripe fruits made his mouth water. Eigle did not seem to want to let go of his hand. She led him through a long hall and opened a door. They entered a chamber containing a simple trunk, a wooden table, and a stool. Richard had been expecting something more splendid in such a house, but he said nothing. While Eigle was fishing something out of the trunk, he contemplated the fine shape of her little bottom. She laid a knife, a ball of yarn, a needle, and a few small pieces of bone on the table, and sat down. The knife and the needle were made of a yellowish metal. Hesitantly, Richard took the fur from his shoulders and handed it to her. Her head was right in front of his stomach. Unconcerned, she took the fur, spread it out on the table, and began to work. There were no chairs or benches in the room. Richard sat down on the floor and looked at her. Eigle's small hands moved quickly and accurately. She cut pieces from the fur, sewing them elsewhere. Soon she had made a sleeveless jacket. Richard accepted the piece of clothing and put it on. To his relief, it covered his thighs. From the mane she had made a collar. The pieces of bone served as buttons. She gave him a dazzling smile. "Now I will introduce you to Erythea," she said. Third section, the convalescent. Eigle got up and went to the door. Richard took his club and his sack and followed her. From the hall she led him up a staircase to the second floor. She stopped in front of a door and knocked softly. There was no answer. She opened and they entered. Inside was just a bed with a curtain. Eigle stepped up to the bed, pulled the curtain aside and gave him a sign to come closer. In the bed lay a young woman with long black hair, slit eyes and high cheekbones. Whereas in the face of the 6 others there had been nothing but a naive gaiety, hers was an expression of limitless sorrow. When she saw Richard, she lifted her head slightly, opened her mouth and tried to speak, producing a slight moan. Without a conscious decision, Richard stretched out his hand, touching her cheek. Infinitely slowly, she raised her hand and laid it on his. Then she closed her eyes. A tear slid down to her mouth. Richard was unable to speak. He moved his hand and she let go of him. He stroked her lightly and felt her trembling. Agle nodded in the direction of the door. Richard remained for a moment. "She has lost her will to live," Agle said, as they were walking down the hall towards the stairs. "She was always so cheerful. She loved to sing and dance like the rest of us. Now she even refuses to eat from the tree. Have you seen how old she has become?" Richard overheard the question. "She's the daughter of the Chinese, isn't she?" he asked. "That's why he sent me here." She looked at him, confused. "You are here for us all, Richard. Come, I'll take you to the tree." She put her arm around him. Her touch excited him. Hesitantly, he embraced her. "Why are there no men here?" he asked. "Our father does not allow it." "Doesn't he want your happiness? Children, grandchildren?" "Richard, I'm already pregnant." "We're all pregnant. We have been for ages." He stopped, let go of her and stared at her. Her stomach was completely flat. "By whom?" he stammered. "By our father, the lord of the underworld." "And how long?" "We don't know. As long as we eat from the tree, we are safe. But sometime in the future we will all give birth to monsters. You see, our father hated our mother. He wanted her and he hated her, for she was beautiful and he was ugly. And so he hates us too, for we are an image of our mother. He has ensured that we cannot bear children, for we carry his poison in us. He is the god of sickness, and he hates everything that is strong and beautiful, for that he can never be. And he hates you most of all, Richard, for you are the strongest. Richard, you must never leave us." She grabbed his arm, looking imploringly into his eyes. Richard did not feel very strong. He was neither courageous nor a particularly loving person. He was no hero and he had no ideals. He was just a male animal wanting to protect his female from other males. Her hair smelled of spring. He wanted to tear off her dress, right here in the hall. He became conscious of the fact that he was pressing himself towards her. "I won't leave you, Agle," he heard himself saying. She smiled and leaned her head against his chest. Before them lay the gate to the orchard. They walked out, embracing each other.